6 o'clock, and I want to thank you all so much for coming. It really means a lot to us that you're taking part in this panel discussion. I'm Charlotte Gilbert, and I'm the Director of Library Services here at Shake Library. And then you have Jane Cox over here. She's the Public Services Librarian here, and she's going to monitor any questions that we may have if anyone decides to join us remotely. In the meantime, just right before I start introducing the panelists, my only role here, besides to tell you what I'm getting ready to tell you, is to help moderate and keep these fine folks in line. I'm sure they really don't need me, but and just to help start or instigate some questions as things come along. But I'm hopefully you guys just take over my role and I get to sit there and absorb because they're here to answer our questions. One of the things that I wanted to mention in case you didn't know, and there is a small display out in the lobby, this building was named after Judge Shake, and he was one of the Nuremberg trials judges when they had those during aftermath of World War II. So that's one of the reasons actually that we decided to write the grant to get this display here, as well as just a perceived kind of lack of knowledge of World War II and the things that were kind of going on. I was teaching a class of about 40 students, and only one of them heard what the Nuremberg trials were. So I kind of felt like this was meeting that definite need for our community and the students, and we've had a lot of positive feedback on it. And speaking of feedback, once everything's over, we do have pens and feedback forms over there, so I invite you all to please leave some thoughts with us, on your experience. And now I'm going to start with one at a time, and I said I would say their name. I'm going to let them talk, and then we'll move on down the line. They know more about themselves than I do, so why not, right? So we're going to start with Jill Weiss Simmons. I knew I was going to get that wrong. She works at the Indiana Archives and Records.
Yeah. Okay, so I, for 16 years before I went to the archives, worked for the Indiana Historical Bureau, mostly with the State Historical Marker Program, which is why I was asking about the Gimbel's marker. And that's sort of made me an Indiana generalist as far as my topic area. And now I'm at the archives in an outreach position. Going to be mostly working on online collections and increasing accessibility. What brought me to this topic was when I was in Washington, D.C., and I visited the Holocaust Museum, and I think, like a lot of people, that was really a transformative experience. And I was very interested in what Americans knew about the Holocaust and the History Unfolded newspaper project. I just became a citizen historian contributor to that project. And through looking at Indiana newspapers, I found so much interesting things that concur with the general national events, and then things that were different. And so I did some blogging around that as well, and some articles. And I think that's what brought me here.
Yeah. And then we have Christopher Fisher, who is the Associate Dean of College of Arts and Sciences at Indiana State University.
I'm here, have my journey here. I'm actually a German and French historian by training. Associate Dean is just the unfortunate task I choose to take on for anyone who's in academia. I joined the dark side. But I'm a historian by training. So as a German historian, I've taught the Holocaust for several decades. And so that's part of the entree. And then to the American side of this, one of the challenges of being an associate dean is you can't go and do the research over in Germany that you'd like to do, or in France. You can't travel because you've got a day job. So I started to try to figure out what are projects that I can do more locally. And one of those led me to working on how did soldiers try to help victims of the Holocaust get back to the United States. If anyone's been up to Candles Museum, most people know Eva's story, but her husband Mickey got back to and came to Terre Haute largely because of the help of a lieutenant colonel in an American engineering battalion. So I started working on that, and that actually took me to the Holocaust Museum on a workshop last year where this exhibit is on display, and talked with the historians there. And then I've been using some of those tools in my own class, especially some of their online research tools. So that brings me here.
And then we have Cindy Killian Frederick from the Knox County Public Library, and I would say resident historian for that place. She's combed through all of their newspapers about this subject. So.
Well, let's see. Basically, I do a lot of genealogy research. I also am now working on our Black History Project, where we have went 1790 up to 1920, and we are taking all the information from files, books. We have slave register there, we have the indentured servant stuff, and so that's my research at the moment. But I've always been fascinated by the early papers. Also working on the MIA project with the Indiana DAR, which is going through the World War II records for military. Currently, we're trying to get brick for the 50 MIAs in Knox County who are soldiers. So that's currently what I've been doing for them. So that also ties into the World War II. So it made me interested in looking up their stories and stuff in the newspapers.
Well, thank you all for being here. Gazella Summit was supposed to be here today, but she is unable to attend. And so she gives her regrets on that, but she actually knew and spoke with and interacted with a lot of the local Jewish families here in Knox County. So it would have been wonderful to have some of her perspective on the effects of all of this, but unfortunately she wasn't well. So I have a list of questions to kind of get us started, but you guys should feel free to take over that role at any time as you now know their backgrounds and the things. Yeah, you want to start it?
Well, no, I just wondering if everybody could talk louder.
If I could talk, oh yeah, I could talk louder. So everybody can talk louder,
Not a problem.
So if you do have questions, so just raise your hand, we'll get you going. I just have a few to kind of get us started. And my first one, and this isn't to anyone in particular, what did the average Hoosier know about the Nazi persecution of Jews at that time?
I'll get us started. So since I kind of had an outside perspective as somebody that went to the Indiana papers without a theory one way or the other of what I was going to find, I was surprised at how much information was available, starting as early as 1933, the opening of Dachau, which at the time was a work camp for political prisoners, not a extermination center. We're a long ways away from that, but starting that early, there was plenty of information in the newspaper. The anti-Jewish boycott in 1935 was kind of the next big event I saw Indiana papers cover, mostly reprinting articles from the wire services, Associated Press and whatnot, on page 6, on page 9. But surprisingly, some local papers would put things on page 1 before I'm really seeing that happen at a national level. I remember the anti-Jewish boycott was on page 1 of a Logansport paper. And then the Jewish Post and the Indianapolis Recorder, both of those newspapers I found did a lot more editorials, columns, more call to action than the average paper. But
Yeah, I think you just have to think if you look at the newspapers, it really depends on where the major events in Nazi persecution of Jews. That tends to be when you get big blips. So the boycott is one blip. Some of the Nuremberg Law, that's a little bit harder to dig for. People didn't quite know what to make with it. And then we can also get into like how was that interpreted depending on where one was in Indiana, because the Nazi racial laws, if we think about America at the time, may not have seemed that far off to some people. But then the big one that almost every newspaper I've looked at, front page news for several days, is the November pogrom, Kristallnacht. That's you look at almost, I couldn't find a paper where that's not the front. How it gets interpreted and some of the controversies that follow, we come back to later. And then when we get into the war, it really depends. There are moments when the wire services are picking up major stories about knowledge coming out about the Holocaust, but it's sort of in drips and drabs. And we also, we'll get to like why that may be, but it just really depends on the moment in time. I think Kristallnacht is the one where you just, every newspaper you find, it's there, sometimes multiple stories.
The papers around here, they usually buried that towards the back, and it would be a very small column. We had a very small Jewish population at the time, and a lot of them took the Jewish newspaper out of Indianapolis. So they received their news from Indianapolis, and then they would talk within their own group. But it was very limited newspaper coverage in Knox County. They were more covering the different family had a son go in. So that was the most newsworthy there, and the things that were going on in George Field across into Lawrenceville with the training and stuff.
One thing just that you made me think of too was that it's hard because the Holocaust is such a major event not to project it backwards. So we have to think about when people are reading about the Great Depression, about the New Deal, that these little bits of news coming out of Germany weren't leading up to anything as far as they knew. There was an atrocity here, an event that people were grappling to understand there, but as far as they knew, it was just part of the news of Europe. So in a lot of ways, they were removed from that and not looking for a pattern or an escalation necessarily, but.
Yeah, and my students, a lot of times when we're reading these headlines, like, how did they not do more?
Yeah.
I said, well, and usually there's something going on in the news, and I've been around for a while, so when I was in college, it was Yugoslavia and Rwanda, or Syria, or Ukraine. How much do you pay attention to this? Oh yeah, I know what's going on. Well, what should we do about it? Oh, I don't know. I read it in the, in my whatever today the equivalent of the newspaper is for the students, and I don't know what that is always, but whatever it is, it's that weird, it's a flash in the pan, but it's buried amidst a bunch of other stories.
Yeah. That's basically what it was. It was buried within the stories, unless you were Jewish and you were looking for the information that was in the paper.
So what kinds of things were being reported? We mentioned a couple things, the Olympics being one. So can you guys kind of expand on, what specifically was communicated?
Yeah, I think a lot of what Chris was saying, when you had a major event, you would get a news spike, and maybe we'll circle back to what you said about how the interpretation was sometimes not what we can see it for now. So early on, I think we even get a lot of the wire services repeating some of the German propaganda. So like in the case of the boycott, it wasn't necessarily clear to Americans that this wasn't retaliation for something. The Germans were saying that it was the Jews that were spreading anti-German propaganda, and they were boycotting in retaliation. So you'll see some of those articles from that perspective repeated in Indiana papers, because if you think about the wire services, how often they would just go to the press in that country and then report what they were hearing. So,
and then I think when it's a really big story like Kristallnacht, they have pretty good news, and it's pretty contemporaneous. So Kristallnacht is 9th, 10th of November. Look at then 10th, 11th, 12th. They have pretty good reporting. It's pretty clear. Do they know the full scale? No, but they're telling stores are being destroyed, synagogues are being burned down, people are being rounded up. Like they've got all the basics of the story there. It's just a question of, is it a 2-column story, a 1-column story, something in the corner of the front page? That's usually front page. I think where it gets a little murkier is when we start getting on the reporting in, say, 1942 in the summer a little bit, and then much more so in late 42 on what we now know as really the Holocaust proper in gear, they know something's going on. They're getting reports of, is it 750,000? Is it 101.7 million Polish Jews being killed? Is it at one camp? There's a lot of, they know something really bad is going on, but there's a lot, not all the details. And then it's buried amidst a lot of other war news.
I think the thing that they were watching around here was that Jesse Owens, who was a Black person, was participating and winning in many of his events. So I think they were looking at that. There was a large population of Germans in Knox County, in Westphalia, Sanborn, who still spoke German and had German newspapers and stuff. So they, because of the propaganda and their fear, stopped publishing things in German. They stopped going to their German churches. They had a pastime club, which was a German club, which they changed. So they were looking at it from the German side, which were going to be somewhat persecuted because they were from Germany and had ties back to Germany. So to me, the Olympics at that time, they were more fascinated with the Jesse Owens, who is very big in the Olympics.
And we saw that after World War I too, in Indiana, the stopping of teaching German in schools, the shuttering of the German language newspapers, and that's still on people's minds. This isn't that much later for some people. So there was so much anti-German war propaganda that turned out to not be true after World War I, that when they do start hearing about these numbers coming in, there's a lot of people that think that this is surely exaggerated. I mean, we've never had numbers like this. Like, I mean, what is 2 million? What is 1.2? You can't wrap your head around it. And so I think that's a really good point about the German, many German origin Hoosiers had been here before, had faced prejudice before. So, yeah.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
In the newspapers, did you find much about how Germans were treated here?
Yeah,
I had a terrible experience in 1944. Our family.
You should tell us, yeah.
Well, there was a whole group of people, I don't know who they were, who came and threatened to take us to Texas and for speaking German.
Wow.
And as a kid, I was scared to death. And only, finally, 1945 came and the end of the war. So, and when we went to visit other Germans, my dad disappeared. I don't know where didn't know where he went at first. He went with the other men into the wine cellar or the root cellar to talk German, where no one else could hear.
but the POWs were brought in here and were stationed down at
At the
Kimo
river.
Park, right
Yeah.
next to what we call Cooper's Woods.
Correct.
So they were stationed down there and they were treated very well. They went, picked apples, or, all the different fruits for the canning factories that were here. There was a
Correct.
canning factory in Washington, Vincennes, can't remember what the other one was. But so because of all the workforce going into the service, they used them to do all this picking and even worked in the canning factories.
Correct.
And I think there was 300 at one time that were stationed down there.
Right.
And then they had to pack up, they had to build their own area. They had, when they moved them out, they packed everything up and left, but they said that they were invited to people's homes where they had picked for Sunday dinners and stuff. And I can't imagine that, but Knox County, you know what I mean by that.
Yeah,
They
I
didn't invite
remember-
anybody in the first
I
dinner.
remember going to a tomato field where the German
Yes.
POWs were kept, and they hated it because tomatoes are poisonous. During times of starvation, they ate the plant, and so many died in Germany.
Yeah.
My father had never eaten tomatoes. He wouldn't eat tomatoes.
Well, I get
They
it.
had no lunch, they were supposed to eat either apples or whatever they could get.
But they were paid to go and work in the factory, and they were paid a small amount to work in the fields. It wasn't very
Not much.
much.
It was pennies, and then when they got a check when they left, and those that went to East Germany couldn't do anything with checks.
We have a box at the library that lists the names of the guys that were working
Okay.
and what they were paid. It's interesting to read the different
I'll have to
names.
look at that.
But they were treated very, very well. And the kids, they said, would set up on watch them play soccer and stuff down in the
Correct, that was a
field.
new sport.
Yeah, because it was totally new to them, and they would sing songs and people would,
Right.
you know, so.
But my dad tried to find out if anyone was from his area, and the guards wouldn't let him talk to anybody.
Well, probably because of,
Yeah.
you know, they were prisoners, but they
And
said that
one fellow was shot on the truck going to where they were gonna work in the orchard. Not sure why. Maybe he went to perhaps retrieve his hat that blew off. I don't know why.
I haven't seen that at
Okay.
all.
But I did interviews with people.
Yeah, but I mean, overall, they were treated much better
Yes.
here
Yes,
than what our prisoners of war were
correct.
in Germany.
Yes.
How many, did you say 300 POWs?
Yeah.
How many of them stayed here?
None of them,
None.
they all went
They all
back.
went back?
They had to
They
go
went-
back.
They all went back. A couple of them came back to visit
Right.
where they had made friends with some of the people in town, like where they had visited and worked. But no, they all had to go back.
That was a requirement.
That was
They
a
didn't have
requirement
any,
because they were a prisoner of war, so they were sent back home.
Right.
Looked at the newspapers, of course, the synagogue was across from the Lutheran church site. I was curious if there was anything in the newspapers in the 40s about that. I don't know.
We can't hear your question.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, talk that way. They wanted you to repeat the question louder.
This way.
I said there was a Jewish community in Vincennes, and the
Right.
synagogue was across from the Lutheran church, of course. I'm just curious in the papers, was there anything, and I haven't looked, but did you find anything representing what they were there or doing?
The temple, you mean, or?
Yeah.
Yeah.
They held that was their services that they held and stuff. BU took over that cemetery after the temple closed and stuff. They took over the rights to take care of the cemetery out there on Main.
One of the Dumas descendants, of course, is publishing a book,
Yeah.
and the Indiana.
Well, the Gimbos were buried there at one time, and then they dug up them and moved them
That's
out east. So, I'm not sure how many people are still actually buried in that cemetery.
You had to be of Jewish descent to be buried there. And my father was Jewish, my mother was not. Therefore, he wasn't buried in, because she couldn't be buried next to him. And the synagogue was on 8th and Harrison.
Right.
And over the time, there was a very small community, but you had to have 10 men to hold a service in the synagogue. And there was enough for Lordsville and Vincennes that they could hold services. And when they decided they couldn't maintain it anymore, that's when they made the arrangements with VU, and they gave the property in the synagogue to VU, and VU has agreed to take care of the cemetery.
I think the
Oh,
city now
Main Street.
does, though. But you turn it over, I think the city cemetery people do it now, don't they?
I don't know, but the last Jewish person that was buried, I believe was Dumas, I think it was Bill Dumas. I don't know whether Stanley was buried there or not. He may have been.
Stanley's there.
Stanley's there.
They're all related, most of them.
Right,
except for-
right.
And the Gimbals that were there were all related.
Right.
The Dumas book is coming out next year. So. The Gimbel sign dedication is May 16th.
When is it?
Noon, May 16th. And some of the Gimbel descendants are going to be
When did you say it is?
We still couldn't hear what date you said.
here. Friday, May 16th.
Okay.
Noon. I knew.
I knew.
Was there, quite a bit of anti-Jewish feeling here in Vincennes? I didn't
I don't think so.
find that out.
I really don't think so, because they were very prominent business people here.
Right,
They had the Gimbals. And then there was, most of the shops downtown that were high-end retailers and stuff were Jewish. And I really don't think there was any prejudice against them because everybody knew them from working, in the, going in and purchasing suits and hats and stuff.
They even had a big celebration to honor the Gimbel family here in Vincennes.
Yeah.
Around that time, like a big celebration here in town to like celebrate it. I don't know if it was the store's anniversary or.
They had several stores at one time. They had the big store and then some of the family branched off into other stores and stuff that did certain things like, the farm implement, groceries, and then of course the big store that was burnt down.
I'm curious to ask the professor a question.
Sure.
We know Ava Core.
Yeah.
So how many people who were were there lots of people from the Holocaust that eventually came to Indiana?
There's a decent number. I don't know if there's a registry somewhere that, do you know if there's?
I know that, I think maybe it's the Jewish Federation. They have information on Indianapolis, I know, and they at one time were over 100 Holocaust survivors. And it can be kind of hard to track because so many people came, like first to the DP, the displaced persons camps, and then to Indiana. So.
And then I think, it's also hard because like Eva's easy because she's prominent, but Eva didn't start off coming to Indiana. She gets here very, if you know her story, Mickey comes back to America, finishes high school, does his military service, gets his degree at Purdue, gets his degree at Purdue, and then does his military service, comes back, working around the pharmacy, goes to visit one of his brothers who also survived up in the Northeast, and his brother says, you gotta go to Israel to find a wife. Goes to Israel, meets Eva, they within 2 weeks agree to get married, brings her back to Terre Haute. So she's in Terre Haute because he came to Terre Haute because a lieutenant colonel was the one who helped get him here. So that's their sort of.
That's really
right. So and it also depends on how the survivors term themselves. So Walter Summers, who was also one of the founding members of Candles, he didn't consider himself a survivor. His family came over before the war. So how do you count those who came over between 33 and 39? My wife's grandparents, same deal. They ended up in Rhode Island in 39. They never considered themselves survivors. Refugees, yes. Survivors, no, because they didn't go through the same experiences. So I think that also is one of the things that can cloud how you count that.
Now, Michael Brown is one of our speakers. He's the very last speaker we have for this series. And he will be, it'll also available on Zoom, but that question might be a good one for him that he might be able to, although it's not about his talk is different than that, but that doesn't mean you can't ask those kind of questions, of course, because he'll be available to us.
So the prejudice against Jews, whatever there was nothing compared to the anti-prejudice, correct?
I think, apples and oranges, the anti-Semitism is always a flexible prejudice that shows itself in different ways. I think just having to grapple with our clan history and whatnot, we've had anti-Semitism for a long time. We've had anti-Catholic sentiment, anti-Eastern Europe sentiment, and anti-Black sentiment. I think there's also a big difference you've probably found through the older families like the Gimbels and the German-speaking Jews that assimilated very quickly, and then the new refugees that were coming from Eastern Europe. Even some of the earlier Jewish immigrants didn't want them to come because they were afraid that it would stoke more anti-Semitism. So,
and I think, given what our topic is, one of the places you can see this is in November 1938, Father Coughlin, and I don't know if everyone knows who Father Coughlin was. He was a right-wing demagogue, Catholic priest, probably one of the biggest radio personalities of the 1930s. He more or less blamed Kristallnacht in one of his shows on the Jews. and it causes a controversy. And one of the interesting things you can do, and so like in the unfolding history and other places, if you put in Father Coughlin and those dates, you can see some papers are saying Father Coughlin says, horrible, things about it, and others it's like there's a controversy around Father Coughlin, or Father Coughlin offers his view on. So you can sort of get just even in the headlines a sense of where that paper's editorial slant may lie. So is that a direct evidence of anti-Semitism or anti-Semitism? No, but it at least gives us a hint as what the editorial goals of that particular newspaper happen to be. Or there's a few newspapers where some of these things don't actually ever show up. And they have like the Decatur Times. If you look, they have the wire services, the same ones at the South Bend Times, the Palladium in Richmond or whatever but they're not popping these stories up. So you'd have to find out who the editor was and dig into that. But it does say something that they're not picking these stories up and others are.
I will say that there was a huge difference because the blacks weren't allowed to eat in certain areas of the restaurants. They had to go upstairs at the movie theater. But the Jewish, yes, but the Jewish were not, they were white, so they did not have to go through what the black people did. They could go into a restaurant. They didn't have to go in a back door that said colored only. They didn't have to check in with the green book where they could stay and where they couldn't stay. So the Jewish did not have to account for their color. They were white. So there was no prejudice against them as far as eating or traveling or staying in hotels. You had even back in the 40s, there was, they could not go to certain restaurants. They could not go in to watch a show or anything else without having a certain area where they couldn't go. Or there would be a sign that says no blacks allowed. You didn't see that, no Jews allowed to go in here or anything. So you had that.
And I think for a lot of people, like a few are okay.
Yes.
So like we're not seeing overt anti-Semitism on the streets in Indiana, but remember that people are still, like we see from some of the polls that are out in the exhibit, people are still very against letting in more Jewish refugees and are advocates.
And East Europeans.
Eastern European, yeah. And so some of the advocates for bringing in more Jewish refugees were very careful to not even use the word Jewish. So I've studied James Grover McDonald, who was on Roosevelt's Commission for Refugees. He was always very careful to say that it was a humanitarian problem and not a Jewish problem, and that these were political asylum seekers because there was so much like feeling of that people didn't want more.
Yeah, FDR couldn't say publicly, we were fighting to save Jews.
No,
People would not fight.
exactly.
And I would take that a step further. And Daniel Green, who's one of the authors of the original exhibit in DC, would say that he was always just ironclad. Our goal was to win the war. And by winning the war, that will help the Jews. But yeah, he would never come out and commit to that publicly.
Yeah, and that is part of the exhibit. You can see that in the propaganda poster section where it highlights that our propaganda posters showing why Americans were going to war talk about fighting for American values, but none of them ever mention the Jewish people.
Interestingly, in 1960, I was at Lake Michigan, and there were signs at different places there. No Jews, no, even 1960.
You had a question in the back?
Yeah, when you mentioned Westphalia and Sandburn a little bit earlier, it makes me a little bit sad that I'm not able to ask my late grandmother, who was a Freelandville Flying Dutchman.
Yeah.
I really would like to ask Grandma what it was like being in school and having the Eversport Powers and the Sandburn Blue Jays and the Bruceville
There was
Hilltoppers.
always that competition.
All playing basketball, yeah, and so I'd like to really ask her and get a sense of what it was like when people did all the others look at the Freelandville Flying Dutchman and go, you guys are German, that kind of, was it that deep?
You can go online on the Vincennes papers through the Knox County Public Library, through the historical newspapers, and you can go back and find some of those sports things. But when it comes to basketball, I don't think there is any kind of line. I mean, I was a Washington Hatchet, you know what I mean? And all my kids went through stinking Lincoln, you know? So I'm still a Hatchet. I don't care how long I'm over here. You know, my husband is a big Alice fan. So, you know, I really, when it comes to basketball and stuff, I think that's competition between the schools. And I don't think they held any kind of thing against it for that because they were just out to win the basketball game.
I do wonder if there was any talk though, you know, among all the high school.
Most of the people at that time in those schools were German, so they may have talked between themselves. And they were mostly big farming, you know, that's a big farming community. So, and they may have talked in themselves, but stayed within themselves,
That makes sense.
you know.
Well, you talk to Vietnam people about Freelandville Germans.
Yeah,
They, two different.
I know, but you know, they all stayed within their section. They had like little areas, this German, they may have talked a different German language than this one and everything, but it was, I don't know how to say it, very secluded, you know, they stayed within their groups. But if you go back in the newspapers, you will see several things where they were attacked or different things because they were German.
We had a question, we had another question in the back.
Just back to the anti-Semitism discussion. My grandfather wasn't allowed to try to get into the Masons because he was Jewish. And that was something that always stuck with him. And my dad had a group of friends that wanted, I don't know if the word's pledge, I don't know what you do to try to get into Masons because it was not even considered. Dad wouldn't even consider it except for kidding. You know, he said that they wouldn't let Dad in and I'm not even trying.
It's a sign of the times.
I think with both of those experiences, that's, you know, the root of why we see Black and Jewish cooperation heading into the civil rights movement. As early as the 1940s, the late 1940s, so the NAACP and some Jewish groups in Indianapolis came together to desegregate a movie theater. So that's, I mean, some of those shared experiences of oppression are why we're seeing the Indianapolis Recorder, the Black paper, and the Jewish Post report in a more similar way. So, yeah.
And I don't, you know, Dad loved Vincennes. I mean, he loved Vincennes. I mean, that's why my name's Alice. And so proudly, he's a proud Lincoln grad. But he was real active in minority studies and always taught at historically Black universities. And I'm quite sure that it had to do with his experiences here, but it wasn't like, it was not negative, it was just whatever was imprinted.
I can relate to high school in Chicago and in Vincennes. Let me say, and I lived in Lincolnwood and Skokie, which was about 99% Jewish. My father was Jewish, my mother was Lutheran at the time. When I went to high school in Vincennes, my dad always asked if I'd go to the high holiday services with him in Evansville at the time that the temple was closed down here. Lincoln, it was an unexcused absence and I received zeros for those days that I was out for the high holidays. I went to Chicago and I decided I didn't want to stand out. So I went to school during the high holidays. I was the only kid in class. So it kind of depends where you live but in the early 60s, it was, you got zeros here at Lincoln if you were out for a religious holiday, but it wasn't a.
Yeah.
I'm also Jewish, and I will be enjoying a lovely Good Friday off from my state job. And I'm gonna be out of town coincidentally, and it's Easter weekend. I'm like, oh, right, there's not gonna be anything to do. But the Jewish Museum's open, so.
So, I'm sorry, Dennis, did you have a question?
I'm originally from Terre Haute. Bloombergs were a really strong Jewish family in Terre Haute. The guy that founded Commercial Solvents, can't think of his name, later became president in Israel. He's very influential. Very strong Jewish community there. My question relates to the fact, like most of us, we didn't know the full ramifications of the Holocaust until really after the fact, right? And so even influential Jewish people in Terre Haute would not have known.
They would not have known. I mean, where you see, I just thinking about this talk, or this event, I went in and there's very good digitized archives for like HIAS and the Jewish ADGF, so and so I went and looked at it, and what you see is not necessarily individual records, but you can see a lot of the larger communities in Indiana being asked for and trying to meet the needs of some of these refugee societies. And they would sometimes include, okay, here are some examples of our outreach, here's some of the letters we were sending to some of our donors. So they are trying to help in some way, but they don't necessarily know, as you said, the full scale of what is going on. But I think, even in the exhibit here, touches on this, that one of the things that Eisenhower really wanted in April and May of 45 was, let's get this documented. I want congressmen here, I want film here, I want politicians walking through, because he didn't think people would believe it. Like they said, and it probably goes back to the World War I issue. World War I, some of the propaganda against the Germans is absolutely true. A lot of it, they weren't really bayoneting nuns. They weren't killing babies. Did they burn down towns? Absolutely. Did they shoot civilians? Absolutely. So it's in that in-between space that people had doubts. And that's why they need to, that's also why it made it so hard for people to believe. We don't have trouble nowadays believing that there's something horrible going on. And again, fill in the horrible place that we've heard about in the last 50 years, because we know these examples, or we now know a lot more about the Armenian genocide of the First World War. So I think that's part of the problem, is they know that they're needing to help, but this stuff is coming out in drips and drabs. And they're facing a hostile population, because the exhibit here only goes through 45. The reality is we get to 46, 47, 48, and the American population is still pretty much against increasing immigration. I mean, the bill in 48 to increase refugees, that only looks like a 3-year sunset, and it still has to be within the quota system. It just to expedite it.
That brings a question that I had actually asked Trent when he was here about Eva and when she went back to Germany after the war, but it was still dangerous for her to actually be there. So I'm kind of curious from this area and even America as a whole, how long those kind of dangers lasted. I can't pinpoint, oh, it was this or this, but different kinds of experiences that the Jewish people might have had here that was a repercussion from what happened. That makes sense? Did I just completely?
No, it makes sense. I guess I feel like the dangers for Jewish people in the United States isn't necessarily different from the Holocaust. I mean, we still have the Tree of Life shooting, or I feel like it's that deep-rooted anti-Semitism that predates the Holocaust is still poisoning the well. It still bubbles and comes out.
I have a question over there.
Well, is it getting worse today? I have family that are concerned.
I think that anti-Semitism always is changing. We're seeing it connected to current events in different ways from across the political spectrum. I don't know that it's getting worse, but it is looking a little different lately, for sure.
It's anti-immigrant too.
Always, yeah. We were in Prague and Budapest last year. Some of the people that we talked to are still hesitant to talk openly about things. Would you say that?
You know, absolutely.
And went to a working camp. And even when you see it, actually, you know, I can't imagine the news reporters at the time, people saying that can be real, but it definitely real. And I don't think our young people have any clue.
I mean, we have all of the evidence available to us today, and it's still so hard to wrap your head around, so.
Some people don't believe there was such a thing as Holocaust.
I know.
And it was a movie studio put up, you know, and not real.
It definitely fits a certain agenda.
I don't get that, I don't think I've ever had a student come out and say like, I don't believe in it. I mean, I've had other things in history they're willing to go to weird places on. Kennedy being one is the moon. But let's leave, that's different discussion, different day. I always just start with, how do we know things about history? How do we know history? It's, you know, it's through documents, physical evidence, and walk them through. Do you know how much evidence that there is of this, whether it's testimonies of survivors, testimonies of the perpetrators, physical evidence? The Nazis were good at documenting what they were doing. I mean, they were good Germans. They like to keep records. So we just, it's an overwhelming. And then when people say, well, but the records don't always line up or they're not perfect. Well, is your memory perfect? You know, like I you know, especially around traumatic events. If anyone's ever been involved in any sort of a crime where the police do the follow-up, I one time was at a restaurant that got robbed. The workers came up with 3 different colors for the assailant's sweatshirt, right? So there's that level. There's also a level of think about how we keep records. Do all the records always line up perfectly? No, we're imperfect beings. But just the mass of records to create all of that, it would be the work of legions to even begin to start that. So it seems like it's a lot easier to think, this is actually real. And then how do we sort through it and make sense of this horrific mass of documentation?
I got the opportunity, I had a best friend here at VU that transferred, and so his new college went to Israel, so we got to spend 2 weeks over there. We went to the Holocaust Museum in Israel, and so one of the poignant moments when we were walking on a corridor through a room, it looked like this size of a room here, and it was a cylinder. And you walk in the middle, it's like a bridge that you walk to the middle, and you look down into the cylinder and you see millions of names documented. And I think that really came home to me about how real it was. The other thing, seeing a whip over there made out of metal, out of braided metal, when I just looked at that, something pierced my soul. It was just, it definitely seeing those 2 things, it came home to me. It really did.
I think that's also why survivor testimony is so important, is we can't get our heads around 6 million. So we can follow this one person's story or our family story or and connect with it on that personal level, because, you know, when we're looking at like what Americans did or did not do, still so many Americans did act. And we have Hoosiers that saved, you know, 2,000 people. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but that's 2,000 lives, you know, 2,000 people that got to start again in the United States, in Palestine, new state of Israel. And I think that even though we can get kind of caught up on like, why didn't they do more? And, you know, we touched on that a little bit, like there are people that acted. There are Hoosiers that acted in small ways, and not just the diplomats and the lawmakers, but average people that did fundraisers that brought just a couple children over.
Well, I was gonna say, were you talking about the Goshen professor?
I was gonna talk about Sarah Wolf Goodman, but go ahead, tell us about that.
So I'm all of a sudden blanking on the name, but there's a French professor at Goshen College who goes over and helps rescue lots of Jews. She comes back, lives her life. Now she eventually gets recognized by Israel as being one of the few Americans who has done really great things, but she doesn't tell anybody about it. So that's the other problem about this story is not everybody was doing this and gets documented, or, you know, it's not in a public way. They happen to do these rescues, live their life. It's, you know, it is what it was.
I think sometimes they thought, I was gonna mention Sarah Wolf Goodman. She was a Indianapolis Jewish woman who was actually born in Austria. And there was this really brief window in 1938 between May and September where 2,000 Austrian children had visas that could get them to Palestine. But there was not money to do this rescue operation. So, you know, we're right in the Great Depression. And she gets a letter from a 14-year-old girl that said that her and her friends started this club to raise money for the Youth Aliyah that was gonna rescue these children. And Sarah gets this idea of, well, you know what, the kids are about to graduate, and how about if instead of graduation presents, they asked for money for donations. So this gets into the Jewish Post. The editor of the Jewish Post, Gabriel Cohen, endorses her idea. And all in all, they raised $750 in the name of these children, these graduates. And they are able to rescue just 2 children. But $750 is a lot because the yearly annual income was about $1,000. So they rescue these 2 children, but then the other Jewish newspapers across the nation start picking up the idea. So Miami, Cincinnati, Washington, DC, Seattle, LA, and they end up saving 2,000 children. So even just in your little small realm, I mean, she was a kind of a socialite. She was involved with the symphony and the arts, and she was not a really political person. So I think those kinds of stories are so important because like when we are overwhelmed by the news and our empathy gets worn out, you know, like if it's time, treasure, talent, whatever you have to give, even if it's just a little something in your own little corner, you know, we can do that. We can be here tonight even and just have these discussions and think about how to do better. And that's the real lesson of the Holocaust.
Did you come across information about ordinary life here in Vincennes, Knox County? You know, most people didn't have toilets. Everything was rationed.
Right, everything was rationed. You got your ration coupons. They had metal drives. They had
Taking everything here to Dewey's.
Doomies, yeah.
But
they had, all kinds of different drives. They had women picking up for the Red Cross, doing all kinds of things. We had wardens at night that would do the blackouts and stuff and do the whole routine. Then you had George Field that had all these military training for pilots and stuff going on. You had the USO for the whites at Perry, where Perry Furniture is. And then the blacks went to the Dunbar School that were over there. Then you also had, this was all Knox County and Lawrence County men over there being trained. Well, as the war went on, these guys got sent into military service. So you had a lot of women that were from the 2 counties that were being hired to start working at George Field in all kinds of different capacities. So when they shut George Field down, all these people lost their jobs and stuff. And then the buildings and stuff were sold off. The DAR over here has the weird shape of it, it's 2 Quonset huts that were from over at George Field that were put together. The VU moved over in 1951. So those are 2 of them. Other places bought them and turned them into barns. If you go towards the old way to Lawrenceville, there's that old barn that looks like a Quonset hut.
yes.
So, I mean, this was done, you had dances and stuff. You had a lot of Knox County, marriages that married these military guys. So it was a totally different environment, it was, they would invite people over, some of the guys for meals and stuff. They had the dances, they had all kinds of stuff. In fact, when the POWs all left, they had a huge dance at one of the dance halls around here to celebrate that they were leaving and going home. So I can't imagine that nowadays of having it's a different type of environment or something. It was just, so you had a lot of women here that were waiting on their husbands to come home, and they went into the workforce where most of these women had been at home and taking care of their kids.
I remember St. Rose girls married people that were over at George Field.
Yeah, I mean, you had a lot of that. So, and these women didn't come home. They went to some other place where the men had come from mostly.
Weren't there buses to take women to Evansville to work in the shipbuilding and?
Well, there was a lot of them that worked over in Washington they did the parachutes over in Washington and the,
I didn't know that.
yeah, so they were making parachutes and stuff for World War II.
I even saw some articles, just in Indiana in general, Indiana towns, where the women would be taking care of the farm all day and then go volunteer at the canneries that were doing pickles and tomatoes and whatnot for the war effort. So I mean that brings us back to like why didn't people do more? Well, imagine doing the kids the farm, go canning for a couple hours. I mean,
Plus,
yeah.
laundry took 2 days, heating up water in a kettle and then stirring everything by hand.
My grandmother had 12 kids that took in laundry.
Oh my.
My dad talked about for hours doing that wash machine that was arm pull. Dad said we didn't have enough laundry with 12 kids, we had to take in laundry. So
There's a question in back.
If anyone's interested, I wanted to let y'all know that the last barracks in George Field, before the rest of them were destroyed, not the Quonset hut, the barracks, are at the Indiana Military Museum.
good.
So if you're interested, you can come and see them, and there's a lot of information on George Field.
And also, Judge Shake's desk is in the museum as well.
One of his desks is here on campus over in the Homeland Security
Okay.
building. So I don't know if it's open right now, but I know during the day you can go over there as long as there's not a classroom going on during the time.
There's one in the McGrady Brockman building as well.
Yeah. We had a lot of desks.
I was just gonna add, one of the other places you can see the impact of war, and I have a weird habit of doing this when I'm looking at historical newspapers, is the advertisements.
Yeah.
And it's not that what's being advertised necessarily changed, but it's maybe how they're pitching, or, hey, these dresses without pleats, aren't they a great style? And of course it's without pleats because it's less fabric and it stretches further. Or, this brand of detergent is like it's almost like we see like nowadays, almost like kitschy, by like, whatever the truck it is, where it's, George Washington charging against the British with his Ford F-150 or whatever it is. There's a little bit of that going on too, but you can really see in the ads what's going on in terms of the war. It's a different perspective on
You also saw the Victory Gardens stuff being advertised.
Yeah, most people had their backyards or whatever into vegetable gardens, right?
You see a lot of people going back to that nowadays too.
Right.
So
And having chickens in the city.
or rabbits.
Rabbits.
No, that's my family. That was their story, that they grew rabbits for meat.
If you're interested in what life was like here on Vincennes University campus, one of our tech services coordinator, Tiara Basha, went through all of the Vincennes University Trailblazers, the student newspaper here at the time. And she put together a pamphlet, which you can find on the tables scattered throughout the library. It's a pamphlet that has articles from the student newspaper here on campus during World War II. Not only do you get articles about what the students' opinions were of the war at the time, but you also get articles about how classes were changing here on campus, how they were shortening class week, or how they were offering classes to train radio operators for the war. So you get a whole lot of different perspectives from the students, and also how VU was changing its class structure here on campus at the time.
you can go on the Indiana, how I put it, we have historical newspapers that has many of the 40s and 50s has all that, the advertisements. It's a free site through the Knox County Public Library, and it's called Historical Newspapers. Yes, and you can see it from anywhere. Anybody can see it. It's free.
And I think you just mentioned Hoosier State Chronicles as well, through the state library is also free.
I'll add a third. It's not as good for this period, but it's still a really good newspaper. It's Chronicling America, which is the Library of Congress's version, especially if you want to go before 24 or so, is great.
We also have the Bicknell library, Bicknell newspaper, which you would have to come into the library and research it. But the historical newspapers, you'll see a lot of the pictures of the boys that are enlisting. You'll see things from Mary Elware. She was a graduate of the local Catholic schools with the girls, you know, how they sectioned off the guys and the girls.
St. Rose.
St. Rose, yes, I couldn't think of it, thank you. And she was joined the Red Cross, so she would write stories and the newspaper would publish her experiences that she drove the ambulances and stuff at one time. And then they would move her to different places. Like there's one in there where she's stationed at Guadalcanal, and she's talking about what the guys do for leisure and talks about what they're going on, what they're eating, you know, and stuff like that. So a lot of the people were getting that into the newspaper, and they were reading like experiences and stuff for people that were over there. Like guys would send them letters to their parents or their sweethearts and tell them, they couldn't tell them exactly where they were at, you know, but it would be, you know, conversations and stuff. But they may not get them for months, you know. If you haven't seen that story where the black unit goes in and does the postal, they did, you know, that I 6668, I think it is.
That was really.
Yes, but I mean, it describes what happened with all the mail and stuff. It wasn't getting through, and it was tearing up the morale and stuff, so. But I know my father-in-law's pictures in there, talks about him enlisting and where he's stationed at. He was in New Zealand.
We've talked a lot about like what was going on here, and one of the questions I wanted to make sure we got to is that if this isn't coming up on the front page of the newspapers, as we all, of course, hindsight 2020 believe it should have, what was catching the Americans' attention during that time frame?
It really just depends on the week. So if you look at the week before Kristallnacht, there's just been a midterm election. So a lot of it's midterm election. If if there's a big fire in the local community, it's really just whatever is big. And then what you find is the other sections of the newspaper don't change. There's still a comics page. There's still a sports page. There's still an editorial page, which very rarely had anything to do with this. So a lot of the newspaper basically just stays the same. It's the same blocks of news.
Yeah, I think the front pages are the big war news. Whatever New Deal policy is making people uncomfortable or excited. And then the local newspapers, like you mentioned, the people practicing the blackouts or
Red Cross news.
Scrapping or selling bonds, those kinds of things.
One thing my mother complained about a lot during the war, she had the job of doing everybody's laundry and 13 kids. And she would hang up the laundry, then the trains, so many trains came through, all the soot. She would take everything down, rewash it, hang it up, then another train came, and another train. So it was just a nightmare with the war trains.
Yeah. One other thing, just since we talked a little bit about like the different reactions to immigrant groups, was Claude Wickard, the Secretary of Agriculture, was also a Hoosier, and he initiated the Bracero Mexican Worker Program. So we actually are seeing Mexican workers come up at the behest of the US government to work some of the farms to fill the labor dearth and in the canneries. And that actually established a lot of the migrant patterns that we still see some of today. So it was migrant workers coming from these different towns to these places in Indiana where they were treated well. They came back year after year, even after the war. So it's kind of an aside, but
Anyone else have any questions? We've got a great group here to ask.
Does anybody remember, well, you're all too young, the tokens for meat and other things? We had on the farm all kinds of meat, so my dad would exchange meat tokens, egg tokens for sugar, so he could make wine.
Priorities.
Well, let's give our speakers a round of applause. And so, appreciate you guys coming, and make sure if you get a moment to check out the exhibit. But we also have, since you're all mostly from Knox County, there's a couple of posters you might be interested in. One is directly across from the information desk, and it's the Gold Star of Knox County that shows all of those that perished in World War II from Knox County. And then also around the corner from that is also another poster that shows all the people who were affiliated with BU that served in World War II. So, but thank you also. Oh, Tom.
Yeah, I'd just like to say something. As I was going through the exhibit out there, one thing that really overwhelmed me was the value of not forgetting history. And that exhibit is so valuable because, that stuff fades. And you almost have to force people to look at it, or force people, put it in there where it can't be missed. But I mean, there's so much information there that, without displays like this or some other vehicle to make history available and get it out there. I saw parallels of things, in the exhibit that are going on more recently. And it's so valuable to be able to have access to this.
Yeah, I hope we never get to a point where we don't believe that something like this did happen, especially with so much overwhelming evidence to the contrary. I know the experiences I've had just learning about all of this, and the fact that, if I do research, I never find anything about the Holocaust because it didn't exist, right? Until after, so that word wasn't even around to know how to do the research for World War II and all of the atrocities that went with that. So,
Well, thank you very much for organizing this.
of course,
Really a wonderful
well, I
thing.
hope to see all of you at the future events that we do have left. We have another book talk, or a book talk, not another. We have one book talk with Jason Lancer coming up a week from Thursday. We have the director of the Jewish Historical Society, Michael Brown, who actually that one, he's gonna be online. He's not gonna be here, but we are hosting it in here for an interactive discussion as much as we can.
And I'm gonna make a pitch for Jason. He and I were on the same workshop at, is he talking about Eisenhower and the Holocaust? Jason Lancer?
Yes, he
Yeah,
is.
he's great.
I
So if
think
you,
it's your fault I got him here.
that might be my fault, but he's up at Butler. He's great.
It's great, yeah.
that's interesting.
Yeah, when I asked Chris to be here, he was actually at the Holocaust Museum touring and taking part in a workshop of the actual exhibit that you guys see, the traveling exhibit of. So I'm just thankful for all of your time and the fact that you are willing to come here and speak with us and to, be so invested in this mission. So thank you very much.